Hello. Again, my name is Tim Melcher. This is our discussion post number 3. So I took a look at the Battle of Boston, or the Siege of Boston, which took place April 19th, 1775 to May 17th, 1776. This became the opening act of the American Revolution. Militia from New England states prevented inward land movements by the British Army, which had established a garrison in Boston of the Massachusetts colony. So the siege began April 19th, following the battles of Lexington and Concord. When those same Massachusetts militia blocked the access to Boston, the Continental Congress then asked George Washington to take charge of the Continental Army, where he became commander-in-chief. During the siege of Boston, both sides had to work through resource shortages and supply transport issues because the militia had taken control of all the land routes. The British were forced to resupply and reinforce their troops by limited sea access to seaports they were able to hold on to during the siege. But as the Battle of April 19th, 1775 were waging on, the Massachusetts militia were under mismanagement and poor leadership, but they were able to form a siege line around the Boston Peninsula from Boston to Charlestown, Mass. And as citizens in the surrounding areas began to see the colonial militia take control of Boston and fortify its boundaries, other militias wanted to help. So militias from New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut all made the journey to Boston to help fortify the peninsula with the Massachusetts militia. One of the resources I examined was General Gage's account of the later Battle of Boston, published on May 15th, 1775, in an Annapolis, Maryland publication. This document gave us a personal account of General Gage's recollection of one day of the siege, April 19th, 1775, in which he recounts a colonel named Colonel Smith of the 10th Regiment and his movements toward Concord in preparation for the attack on the British. One of the insights that I found was interesting in Gage's account of the colonel. He said the colonel, I'm quoting from the article now, because the colonel called his officers together and gave orders that the troops should not fire unless fired upon. General Gage explains how his colonels fortified easily defendable positions with 10 24-pound guns, and they placed them on the hills surrounding Boston. The second article I examined was based on the accounts of April 22nd, 1775, so just a few days later. This article explains more of the personal side of the siege, discussing the troop movements between April 19th and April 22nd, and how these movements led to the British killing 8 American soldiers. And the troop movements after that proceeded to Concord, where they proceeded to destroy 60 barrels of flour and some carriages, and then began to retreat. The British, that is, began to retreat when about 300 Americans coming up, and a skirmish ensued. So the document goes on to explain how this continued over the next several days and over the next 11 months, but really focuses on this week of time where these subsequent skirmishes happened and troops were being killed. Eventually, the timeline these articles discuss eventually led to the British abandoning Boston after 11 months and transferring their troops and equipment up to Nova Scotia. In June 1775, the British seized Bunker and Breed's Hills, from which the Continentals were preparing to bombard the city, but their casualties were heavy and their gains insufficient to break the Continental Army's control over the land access to Boston. So after this, the Americans laid siege to the city. No major battles were fought during this time, and the conflict was limited to occasional raids and minor skirmishes and sniper fire, but the British efforts to supply their troops were significantly impacted by the smaller but more agile American forces. So this militia operations operating on both land and sea, and the British consequently suffered from a continual lack of food, fuel, supplies, and during the siege. These two articles, I felt, gave us a first-hand understanding of strategic battle planning in these skirmishes. It gave us a look at, personal insights, how colonels reacted to certain situations. I thought they gave us reflective thoughts about the military leaders of the time. Didn't focus on the big military. I liked it focused mostly on the colonels and their reactions to certain things. And it gave us a cause and effect relationship of how these events related to the overall outcome of the war itself, looking at just one particular battle. But what I really felt interesting, but was the focus on the colonels and their reactions to the battles themselves. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing your comments.